Hello and welcome back to my home office where I'll be talking to you for now about mostly stuff out of Chapter 8, but the topic is going to be, for now, it's going to be Washington's administration. So, after the Constitution had been ratified by the states, we have an election in 1788 to elect a new president, which would be our first president because before this time we had been under the Articles of Confederation. And so what we have now is the first and only time we're going to have a unanimous vote for president. George Washington holds that honor. He was unanimously elected twice. As a matter of fact, sometime later in history, and I forget which president it was, there was a unanimous vote. And in deference to Washington, one of the electors decided to cast his vote for another person, therefore keeping Washington as the only man in history to get a unanimous vote for the American presidency. So, when Washington becomes president, he takes office during a very troubled time. The tensions between the United States, France, and England are all kind of bubbling up. There's a lot of problems going on in the world. We're on the cusp of the French Revolution, which is going to bring virtually all of Europe into a major war. It's not a good time, and it's a very scary time for the United States because we're not strong enough to fight a war. We're just not strong enough to stand up for ourselves because remember, without the French's help in the American Revolution, we would have lost that conflict. And so we are still trying to build up our own autonomy and our own power to make sure that we are not wiped off the map by some European power because at this point, pretty much anybody might have been able to do it. So Washington is going to be a very smart guy when he gets into office because he knows that he's not the most book smart person in history. Now, up until the presidency of Donald Trump, Washington was our richest president in history. I don't know if you knew that or not, but he's the richest president. But now, he's also one of our few presidents who does not have a college degree. So he's not super book smart. So if you're not book smart, what are you going to do to kind of make up for that slack? You're going to surround yourself with people who are book smart. And so in this case, Washington's cabinet is going to be his closest advisors. These people that he's going to select, you already know who they are because you know who Alexander Hamilton is. He's going to become Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, who's going to come up with an ingenious plan to kind of build up the American Treasury, if you will. Another one of Washington's appointees is the famous Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson will become the Secretary of State. He's going to be in charge of trying to secure alliances with other nations. If you not alliances, I shouldn't say alliances. We're talking about treaties, so that they won't mess with us. That's what he's in charge of. How well of a job he does is kind of up for debate. But while he is in office and while Washington's administration is in play, they will come up with a treaty with the English, Jay's Treaty, which we'll talk about that again here in just a second. But before we get there, let's talk about Henry Knox. Henry Knox was the hero of Bunker Hill, and he's going to become Washington's Secretary of War. And luckily, we did not have to use him as a Secretary of War while he was in office because Washington's big focus was to keep us out of foreign wars. He did not want us to go to war with any other countries because he knew we weren't strong enough to do so. But Henry Knox was in charge of maintaining the army, training the army, and making sure that we were at least somewhat prepared if the worst did come to fruition. So let's talk about Hamilton's plan. Hamilton knows that we're desperate for cash. As a country, we have to have cash to operate. And so what he comes up with is the plan is to tax whiskey as an income. So basically, if you have whiskey being produced, you pay a federal tax on that to the federal government. And remember, we don't have an income tax this time. So we're going to tax whiskey, which of course was a very common thing back in the day. People drank a lot more hard alcohol than they do in current times. I don't know if you're aware of that. The other thing that Hamilton wanted to do was to sell our federal land. Now, if you're familiar with the map of the United States, those Northwest Territories out there, just the other side of Pennsylvania, those territories were basically open and free land. Never mind the Indians that are there, because we're going to sign some treaties that they're going to give up a lot of that land. Not sure how honest some of those dealings were, but nonetheless, we have that to contend with. So the Northwest Territories are going to be sold off under the provisions under the Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance of 1785 and 1787. Those laws were passed under the Articles of Confederation, but they continue to be very, very powerful and impactful laws that were passed even to this day. If we have a new state to come into the Union, which we could, you've heard rumors about Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, that would be something that would come through the Land Ordinance. So the Land Ordinance is going to be used to sell off that land. That land is going to be used to put in the federal treasury. And that's one of the main things going on in the treasury arena of the United States. Now, there's other stuff going on. Remember, the French Revolution has already broken out. When the French Revolution breaks out, we are in a lot of trouble. We are trying to decide, are we going to take sides here or not? And that's going to lead us to a very important decision that's going to have to be made. So now that the French Revolution has broken out, we have, in short order, all of Europe is going to be aflame. Now, the British, they've just been pests to us for this whole time that we've been an independent nation since 1780, basically. 1783, they signed the peace treaty with us. But they don't really respect us, and they're looking for ways they can get at us. And one of the ways they get at us is in the Northwest Territories, because even up there, while we're trying to sell land and we're trying to bring settlers out there to settle the land, the British are out there. They have several forts out there, which is our territory. So we've got to figure out what to do with that. Also, the British are basically stealing sailors off of our ships and forcing them to work on British ships, Her Majesty's ships of war, and it's a bad situation. And so, if we don't do something, we're going to look like a bunch of idiots. If we do something, then we may end up going to war, and we cannot afford a war with Great Britain. That's where John Jay comes into play. John Jay is going to go to Britain, and he's going to try to negotiate a deal. Now, he does negotiate a deal. We'd call it Jay's Treaty, but the reaction to Jay's Treaty is very mixed. If you were a supporter of Washington on the Federalist team, then you would probably say he did a pretty good job, and the treaty was fairly well done. But if you're a anti-Federalist, also these guys are becoming known as Republicans and eventually Democratic Republicans. These guys are not very happy with that because these guys tended to be pro-French, and they did not realize the extent of the French Revolution, the guillotines and all that. They were kind of just still on the same frame of, these guys helped us during the Revolution, so we should be on their side right now. So that's why there's a little bit of a disconnect there. But when it's all said and done, Washington is going to keep us out of war. Jay's Treaty will have some limited benefits. The British will give up some of those forts out in the Northwest Territories, but they're not going to quit taking our sailors off of our ships. That's a big deal because that's going to eventually lead to a war just a few more years down the road, the War of 1812. But before we get there, let's finish off Washington. So Washington gets 2 terms in office. Washington's 2 terms in office are noted for his ability to, number one, keep us out of war, which he did. And when he leaves office, he says, stay out of foreign entanglements. Don't get involved in foreign alliances. That's a bad deal. But he also said, watch the politics. Stay out of politics. Interesting for a man who was a diehard Federalist. Now, he never said, I am a Federalist, but everybody knew he was a Federalist. So he didn't want America divided into political parties. He didn't think that was good for the country. Look at it today. Who knows? But anyway, so what he says is, stay out of foreign entanglements, stay neutral in foreign wars, and stay out of politics, stay out of political parties, and don't form political parties because they're bad news. So that's how he leaves us. He did a fair job, you got to say, for a guy who didn't have a college education. He did keep us out of wars, and he did do a pretty fair job of, just maintaining America and giving us a solid foundation. But really, it's going to be up to the next guys to see if we can hold on to this republic. So we'll look at the administration of John Adams next, and then the 2 terms of Thomas Jefferson, which is a very interesting tale of its own. So as we've already discussed, by the time of the Washington administration, the relationship between the United States and France was really, really bad. Things are actually getting worse because it seems that by the time Adams is president, we are becoming more and more friendly with the British. Now that seems like that might be an odd thing, but remember, the United States needs its old trading partner, and the British were our old trading partner because we were part of their own government. And so Adams tries to sign some trade deals, which is going to incense the French. They're getting madder and madder. Remember, the French had said, we helped you guys fight your revolution. Now we're in the middle of our own revolution, and where are you guys at? Why aren't you sending us any help? Money, ships, supplies, men, whatever it takes. And so things are going really south really fast with the French. It gets so bad that Adams sends over another envoy to France, and he says, look guys, let's try to work this thing out. And when he sends these men into France to work out a deal, the French are not even going to accept our envoy unless we agreed to pay them a ridiculous amount of money. And then, if we wanted a treaty, we had to pay millions of dollars just to get a treaty signed. This was so outrageous to Adams that we didn't even talk about who these people were. It was so disrespectful of what they'd done to us. We simply called these men X, Y, and Z, and that's why this becomes known as the XYZ affair. So after this, we go into pretty much a war with France. It's called the quasi-war because we don't really declare war, but there's a lot of bad stuff going on. We're sinking some of their ships, they're sinking some of ours, and things just aren't going well at all. But luckily, Napoleon takes power in France. Napoleon is not a guy who's looking for trouble with the United States. He doesn't really care that much about the United States. His focus is he wants to defeat Great Britain. He wants to be the Frenchman who defeats Great Britain once and for all. And because he wants to focus his energy on Britain, he's going to sign a treaty with us that's going to become known as the Convention of 1800. So when John Adams leaves office, he leaves behind a lot of enemies because he's just a kind of an angry man. He doesn't get along well with others. He doesn't play well with others. And so he leaves behind a lot of just broken domestic issues. And on the foreign front, he does have the significant accomplishment of having a treaty with France signed. But in 1800, when the election rolls around, he's just not popular enough to win another election, and that's when Jefferson will defeat him and become our third president. By the time Jefferson is elected president, Adams has a pretty bad reputation as just a cranky old guy. Those ideas aren't completely accurate, but there's a lot of truth to them. If you want to see what Adams was really like, at least from the perspective of one historian who was able to write and direct a miniseries, it's called John Adams. It's fairly recent. It's probably 10 years old by now. Pretty good miniseries, so if you want something to watch to kind of keep us up, the events we've been talking about, that's a pretty good one to watch. John Adams, the miniseries. So now we get into the Jefferson administration, and Jefferson's a different kind of guy. Now remember, Jefferson's from a different political party. That's why they call this the Revolution of 1800. There was no real revolution. There's no real, uprising of the people or anything like that. Nobody's going to be killed. But in the Revolution of 1800, we have the very first time that a political party shift occurs in the United States. Some people thought that might not go smoothly. Some people thought there might be another war just because of that. But as we can see, we have political shifts of power. Those are generally peaceful in America. Generally. Okay, so let's move on. When Adams takes office, it's kind of funny that Adams is trying to pack the courts with as many people as he can before he leaves office. So one of the things that happens is one of these guys who gets an appointment to a judiciary is a guy by the name of Marbury. Marbury comes to the White House looking for his office that he's been promised, and Madison is now Secretary of State, and he says, no, you're not getting that. That's not going to happen because the other guy is the one that selected you. Now we're in. You're not getting that judgeship. And so this guy sues, and it goes to court, goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules. The Supreme Court rules in a very important court case called Marbury versus Madison. Now, the only thing you need to know about that court case is that the Supreme Court said, by the way, we have the authority to basically look at all court cases, all laws, pretty much everything out there, and we'll decide if it's constitutional or not. That's called judicial review. Now, that's not constitutional, but they decided in the year 1803 that it was. And so now we're stuck with judicial review from the Supreme Court, and that's why the Supreme Court is so dadgum important in all cases if you're political in the least bit. If you're Republican, you want conservative justice. If you're liberal, you want liberal justices, and so forth and so on. So Jefferson is gaining popularity. The country's in pretty good shape. It looks like we're mostly out of harm's way when it comes to foreign wars and such. And then we're going to get the chance to make a very big purchase. Jefferson sends an envoy to France to see about buying New Orleans. New Orleans was very important because it's a port, and it was a great place to be able to sell from and to sell crops and trade and so forth, and it's in a very good location. So he sends over folks to buy New Orleans for $5 million, and lo and behold, they get an offer to buy not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. It's a deal that they could not refuse. And shortly afterward, Jefferson's going to send out Lewis and Clark to explore, and there's lots of adventures going on there. And it's just a great time to be an American in the early 1800s then, until things take a decided turn for the worse. Afterward, Napoleon is going to get involved in some major wars with the British, and what's going to happen at this point is everybody wants us to help them. Everybody wants us to trade with them. You got to understand, even though we're a small country and not super powerful, we have a lot of natural resources, and everybody needs those resources to build ships, to build, they're just industry, to get weapons. All this stuff is very important for the French and for the British. So they're all fighting for us. And Jefferson sees this as a big threat. If we get involved with one of these two countries and sell them stuff, we could be considered to be an enemy, and then we may be drawn into a war. So eventually Jefferson is going to push for and enact the Embargo Act, which means that we're not going to trade with anybody. Now what that does is that sets up us for economic failure. Jefferson goes to being a super popular president to overnight being a very very demeaned president. People are very unhappy. People are losing their fortunes. And so after a series of embargo acts trying to figure out how to get this thing right, finally they come up with the insane idea that we will trade with one country, maybe France, or one country, maybe Great Britain. We'll trade with whoever promises to be a good friend to us, and the other one we won't trade with. As soon as we pass that, the French say, me, pick me, I want to be your friend. And of course it's all a ploy. And so France says, we're going to be your friend. And as soon as that happens, the British come after us with guns a-blazing, and it turns out to be really, really bad. And that's going to get us built up for what's going to happen next, which is shortly after Jefferson leaves office and his 2 terms, we're going to go to war with Great Britain because of some of the failures that he had in international affairs. So when Jefferson leaves office and Madison comes into the office of the presidency, we're on the path toward war. Great Britain is pretty much out of control. They're impressing our seamen on the high seas. They've actually even sank a couple of our ships and crippled some of our ships off of our coast, some of them in American waters. It's bad. It's really bad. So Madison eventually calls for a declaration of war, which is passed narrowly. And the war is going to have some real ups and downs. We're going to have some really epic defeats, and we're going to have some real epic victories. Some of our defeats include, losing our capital and having it burned to the ground. That's just traumatic for a young nation and a brand new capital city. But on the other hand, we have some amazing victories. We defeat the British in several engagements, which is very impressive considering the fact that we are just really unprepared for war. Our most dramatic victory is going to be, of course, in New Orleans under Andrew Jackson's leadership at the Battle of New Orleans. But another really big impact that we have is off the coast of Baltimore at the famous fort where Francis Scott Key witnesses the battle in the harbor, and he writes the national anthem. And so there's a lot of things going on here that are going to inspire America. And by the time the war is over, honestly, it's more of a draw. We sign a peace treaty. Britain promises not to be impressing our seamen. We promise not to be, picking fights unnecessarily. And so the war just kind of ends just kind of the way it started. There's not a... but one thing that's important to note, when the war is almost over, when the war was almost over, a large section of New England is going to be really in trouble financially. they had made all their money through trade, and most of their trade is going to Britain. So when we go to war with Britain, they're going to be very embittered about that. And so what they're going to do is they're going to draw up some papers in this Hartford Convention where they're threatening secession. They actually threaten secession. Their members of their conference are actually going to show up in D.C. shortly after the city is burned. And right after the city is burned, it doesn't take long and the war is won, and these guys look kind of foolish after that. So that's going to be kind of swept under the rug. But the Hartford Convention was a big deal, and it's going to lead to a lot of hard feelings later on. So Henry Clay is going to be a major leader in the Senate during this time, and he's going to come up with his thing that he calls the American system. Now, the American system is federal subsidized roads, like we talked about. It's going to be improved canals and shipping lanes, and it's going to be whatever we can do to make America's economy run smoother. And a lot of this has to do with moving further west. We're going to be occupying those territories out west. We're going to be moving up to the Mississippi River. We're going to be occupying these lands, and things are taking a decided change in America as we continue to grow.